Hey everybody, Spacewizard here. It's all but confirmed that Blizzard's announcement on the 28th will be a new adventure, and with this being the first adventure released in the year of the Kraken, I thought now would be a good time to take a look at the previous released adventures and examine Blizzard's design philosophy when it comes to them. In comparison to expansions, there's a much higher percentage of the cards released in adventures that are competitively viable, and because of this, despite having much fewer cards released, adventures have just as much, if not more of an impact on the meta than expansions. Take, for example, Emperor Thaurissan and Grim Patron from Blackrock Mountain, or Reno Jackson and Elise Starseeker from League of Explorers. These are highly impactful cards that force the metagame to be shaped around them. Grim Patron single-handedly spawned an entirely new archetype that, despite getting weaker as time went on, still manages to be relevant in the current metagame with its natural evolution into the new OTK Worgen deck. Reno Jackson and Elise Starseeker found their niche in various control decks, and it's hard to imagine what will replace them when they inevitably get cycled out of Standard. While Emperor Thaurissan is just kind of this gross combo enabler that made Combo Druid the most oppressive deck in the metagame up until Blizzard nerfed the combo into the ground, so people would have a reason to play other Druid decks. There are also less individually unique, but still highly impactful cards that you may take for granted that come from adventures. The most impactful of which is probably Tunnel Trog. Aggro and Midrange Shaman are two of the most powerful decks in the metagame right now, and this card has a lot to do with that. Before League of Explorers, Shamans were pretty much unanimously the worst class in the game. But then League of Explorers got released, and Tunnel Trog was literally the only good card that Shamans got in the entire adventure. But suddenly, Aggro Shaman was an amazing archetype. Sure, it got better when Flame Wreathed Faceless was released, but before that it was still an extremely relevant aggro deck, and seemingly just because Shamans got a good 1-drop. Tempo and aggro decks absolutely need good cards to play on curve, or they just won't be able to kill the enemy hero fast enough. And Tunnel Trog gives Shamans an amazing curve. So there's basically two different kinds of competitively viable cards that Blizzard likes to release in adventures. The first is cards that enable certain archetypes like Grim Patron, and the second is cards that fill in gaps in certain decks' curves like Tunnel Trog. Now, that isn't to say that Blizzard doesn't apply the same philosophy to expansions as well. After all, at the end of the day, every good card in Hearthstone is either going to enable a new archetype or fit into an already existing archetype. But with adventures, this philosophy is much more pronounced. In between the release of expansions, Blizzard has a much better idea of what's going on in the metagame. Everyone has had a while to play around with the huge influx of cards, and with the information Blizzard has at their disposal, they can make much more targeted changes to the metagame with an adventure than they could with an expansion. Cards like Imp Gang Boss are strong enough and flexible enough to give Warlocks a 3-drop for pretty much any deck, and in fact, Imp Gang Boss gets played in just about every Warlock deck. But if Imp Gang Boss weren't in the game, Warlocks wouldn't really have a minion they could play on curve for 3 mana. And that impacts things in a very similar way to how Tunnel Trog impacted Shaman decks. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have cards like Anything Can Happen that single-handedly force archetypes into the forefront of the metagame. Up until Old Murkai was removed from Standard, Anything Control Paladin was one of the strongest decks in the game, and it probably still would be if it was buildable. Now, there are certainly cards from expansions that were just as impactful as Anything Can Happen was. Previous to League of Explorers, Mysterious Challenger created an all-new Paladin archetype that dominated the meta, but if you combine all the cards from Goblins vs. Gnomes in the Grand Tournament and compared the single highest impact cards in each set to the single highest impact cards in Blackrock Mountain and League of Explorers, you're going to see that there are way more cards that affected the game on their own in the adventures. And that's the main difference between expansions and adventures. I'd say that Goblins vs. Gnomes was the set that had the most impact on the metagame as a whole, but that impact came from the combination of many different cards like Dr. Boom, Quartermaster, Implosion, Shield Maiden, Anti-Keelbot, Piloted Treader, and all of the miscellaneous mech cards, of which there are far too many to list briefly. Now, Dr. Boom is an obvious outlier here because he's a disgusting overpowered mess, but let's take the second most overpowered card here, Piloted Shredder, and compare it to Reno Jackson. Which of these cards had the most impact on the game? Now, it's true that Piloted Shredder was played much more than Reno Jackson was played, but imagine that you deleted both of these cards from everyone's collection and what kind of an impact that would have. Piloted Shredder could easily get replaced by the second best 4-drop in the game, but there is no replacing Reno Jackson. Every deck that uses him flat out wouldn't work anymore, and honestly I think the same can be said of non-legendary cards like Tunnel Trog as well. Out of Piloted Shredder and Tunnel Trog, which impacts the game more? If Shamans didn't have their 1-drop, would they still be viable? This is why I'm very interested to see what kind of cards Blizzard has in store for us in the next adventure. Whispers that the Old Gods had to be more impactful than previous expansions were to make up for all of the cards that got cycled out of Standard. So I'd wager that this next adventure is going to be even more impactful than League of Explorers was. That's it for this week's video, guys, but don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I'll be back next week with another new video, but until then, you can check out Hearthhead.com or either of its social media pages for all sorts of Hearthstone-related content. See you next time, everybody.